Hi, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Where is everybody? Oh boy. So I was hoping that my little discussion last week would, or last class would entice people to come to the lecture and do it synchronously. Looks like it hasn't worked yet. Good morning, Stephanie. Anyway, well, hopefully people will join us as we go on. One thing we did notice is that when we do the practice questions, they are only available um, uh, during the actual talk, during the lecture, synchronously. They do not get recorded for whatever freaky reason. So for those of you that are here, you'll certainly have a better, um, exposure to those practice questions. So that's another reason to come. Also, it's going to be fun, I promise. All right. Let me kind of go over some of the things about the class first again, since it's just our second meeting, and then we'll continue. I'll see if there's any questions, then we'll continue with the lecture material. All righty. Let me just get a little discombobulated here. All right. Um, screen, share sound, optimize for video, and there we go. And I'm also going to yes. Okay. The other thing I noticed is if I make my image bigger, it comes out bigger on the recording. So there you are. Okay, you know about the course in terms of its content and everything, and there's my information again on the top. Again, by far the best way to contact me is through email. I should mention, if you have kind of like, you know, simple questions about the, kind of the schedule of the class and stuff, also feel free to ask Dylan. I'm sure he can help you with that, but I can answer your questions too. 2 exams, that's all your grade, nothing else. There's no extra credit or anything. The first exam will be sometime during week 3, and it will not be during our meeting time. It will be some other time. Of course, as we come closer to that date, I'll be talking more about the exam. It will be multiple choice, and the multiple choice will be based on lecture material, book material that I haven't covered in lecture, and material that Dylan covers that also hasn't been covered in lecture or in the book. So it's important you go to those discussion sections as well. Because it's quarantine and you're doing this remotely, we're just doing it as an open book exam. It's a timed exam. I think it's an hour and a half period. And we'll talk about the fact that you do need to study, even though it's open book. You absolutely need to study to be able to answer 60 questions in a 90-minute period. You're not going to be able to learn everything during the test. That was attempted the very first quarter we tried teaching this on quarantine, and it didn't go well. But we'll talk more about that as we get to it. As you already know, that a nice chunk of the questions are actually going to be given to you during our lectures as we do our practice questions. Okay, there's the book information. It is available to you just as a download. And it's important that you read through the chapters as we go through the topics, because again, there will be material that is taken from the book on the exam that is not covered either in lecture or discussion section. It should be fairly straightforward what you should be reading as we go through the lectures, right? There's a syllabus also available. And as I'm talking about sound, you should be going through the sound chapters. And you'll see that, there's certainly overlap between what I talk about and what the book talks about. That's probably the best way to go through it, is to read the chapters that are most relevant to the content I'm presenting in lecture. Okay, let me take a quick second here and see if there's any questions. Any questions? Feel free to just speak up or use the chat function. No? All right. There's a few more of you now. Hopefully that will increase as the session goes on. Okay, then we can continue talking about the material. All right. Share screen. Hold on just a sec here. Hold on, let me just do this. Sorry about this. Things are a little clumsy still. I apologize. All right, good. Okay. I believe I'm sharing okay. Please let me know if I'm not. Looks like I am. Hold on a second. Yeah, all right. So, shoot, hold on a second. I'm sorry. Still a couple of things here. Hold on a second. I apologize, everybody. Let me just get this set up one more time. Share screen. Da, da, da. Why is it not showing me? Oh, okay. All right. Sorry. No one panic. There we go. Okay. There we go. Okay. Hopefully you're seeing me bigger, and I'm sharing my PowerPoint. I'm assuming everything's working. Please let me know if it's not. Okay, I apologize for that. So what have we been doing? We've been talking about one of our first perceptual skills that we're unaware of having, which is being able to hear things that don't make sound. And we first introduced this through this wonderful example of human echolocation that's performed by the blind. But as you now know, this is not something that just the blind can do. This is something that we all can do. We can all learn to do it. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm endorsing you going out this weekend and riding your bike with a blindfold on. It does take a lot of practice. And as you know, there is an advantage to being blind from an early age when it comes to echolocation. But it is something that we can all learn to do to some degree. And maybe more important than that, it is something that your brain, in a kind of low-key way, is doing all the time. It's not doing it well enough to, again, mountain bike or do hiking or something like that, but our brains are using reflected sound all the time. And that is something you'll learn as we meet some of the folks in the movie industry and TV industry in just a few minutes. But I wanted to talk about a few more of the ideas behind echolocation and what we know about the importance of the different parameters. Remember, we talked about the informational parameters of time delay of the signal coming back, the relative intensity of the signal coming back, and then one of our favorite, which is this ripple noise pitch, which seems to work when you're within a kind of close distance of the surface. And this again is information that our brains can use, even if we're not expert echolocators. This is information our brain can use to determine the location of a reflecting surface. So now we're going to get into kind of some of the other details about this that are actually relevant to all of us. I forgot to mention one other thing, that we did talk a little bit about what experts can do beyond the mountain biking, and they seem to have the spatial resolution that rivals our own visual resolution, which is just amazing. We also talked a little bit about the neurophysiology behind that, in how that blind individuals who have become expert echolocators can in fact use their visual brain areas, the part that would typically be used for vision, to help kind of refine this skill, which is really fascinating. It's this kind of idea of cross-sensory compensation that we'll be talking about throughout the quarter. But now I'd like to talk about, the importance of the sound source, because so far the way we've been talking about it, the way I imagine you demonstrated it to yourself yesterday, was by making a sound of some type. Certainly Daniel Kish clicks. In our experiments that we did with intro psychology students, people outside in campus were doing testing 1, 2, hello, hello, I feel silly. The white noise sound works well. But the question is, how important is it that you actually make the sound during echolocation? Okay, certainly there's some advantage to it. That's why Daniel Kish clicks. And Daniel Kish, if you've read through the book, you know he'll use different types of clicks depending on the environment he's in, right? But how critical is it that you're using your sound? Well, let me tell you the full story about that a little bit. One thing we know is that in some of those early experiments, okay, they didn't actually allow the subjects to use their own sound. So once they established this footstep thing, remember we talked about the old experiments where people were determined to be listening to the reflections of their own footsteps. They studied this very systematically and wondered, how important is it that they hear something like footsteps? Can, in fact, other sounds be used? And so what they would do is they'd place loudspeakers that could move along with the blind subjects as they move towards the wall. And that loudspeaker would emanate different types of sounds. So I think at one point they fastened loudspeakers to the person's shoulders, and as the person walked to the wall, the loudspeakers would make sound. Or sometimes there'd be a speaker kind of hanging off of a rod above the subjects, and as the subjects walked up, the loudspeaker would move towards the wall. It's by itself as it tracked the movements of the subject. And all of these experiments were used to determine what type of sounds are good for echolocation if it's not going to be the subject sound itself. And what they found was lots of different sounds. For example, white noises coming out of these loudspeakers fastened to subjects or above subjects. Tones could work too. That's not something that we've discussed yet. Beeps, bells, that sort of thing. And then clicks coming out of the loudspeaker. And in all these cases, the subjects were not able to make any sound themselves, really. I mean, they had, they were not wearing shoes. They were told to be as quiet as possible. The sounds were made by something else. Now, in all these cases, the sounds were made from a location that was similar to, or close to where the subjects were. But then they started doing other things. They started like putting the loudspeaker where the sounds were coming from somewhere in between where the subject was and where that wall was, right? And it didn't move. And so it would be like, you're in the room, and if you're an experimenter, it would look like, the subject is way over here, the wall is over there, and somewhere in the middle, there's a speaker hanging down that's aimed towards the wall, and it's not moving. It's just emanating sounds like that sort of sound going towards the wall. And in that case, were people able to echolocate? Were they able to walk to the wall and stop? And the answer is yes, not quite as well as if they were, the sound, they were creating the sound themselves, or the sound was moving with them. Movement helps now, right? But a sound doesn't have to come from the actual echolocator, him or herself, nor does it have to move along with the echolocator. The sound can come from something else in the room. Again, there's a little, decrease in how well they perform, but they could still successfully walk to the wall and stop before they got there. They might stop a little earlier than they did if the sound was with them, if they were making the sound, but they were still pretty darn accurate. And get this, in some of these experiments, the sounds that were emanating could be very, very quiet. In fact, they could be what's called the ambient sounds in the room. Okay. What does that mean, ambient sound? Well, in this context, all it means really is like the very quiet sounds that are in the room you're in now, say that are coming from your air conditioning. So it's a pretty warm day, right? And you might have your air conditioning on. I have a fan here in the room because I get pretty sweaty when I teach. And that sound is very, very quiet. I mean, I have it at a very low volume so it doesn't interfere. And maybe, maybe you have a fan on in your room or the air conditioning's on, or maybe nothing at all, really. But it's there. And I'll show you how you can determine it's there very, very simply. You can just take your hand like this, your hands like this. Let me just make sure I'm being seen okay. Oops. Yeah. There we go. You can take your hands like this and you can put it over your ear. You can cup your ear like that. And what that's going to do is it's going to kind of amplify whatever soft sounds are in your room, whatever ambient sounds are in your room. Okay, let me do that. Yeah, oh boy, that's that fan sound I think is making me very loud. So go ahead and do that. And you're gonna hear like a whooshing sound, right? Now, you want to hear something fun, right? I don't know if you remember this when you were a kid, but this is why I have that image of the shell there. Did your parents ever tell you to pick up a shell and listen to the waves inside the shell? The idea was, oh, there's the spirit of the ocean is inside the shell. It's kind of a romantic idea. I really like it. And you can tell that by listening inside the shell. There's the waves. And in a way, what's going on with the shell is like what you're doing with your hands. You're amplifying the sound of the waves. However, you don't even need waves to really do that. If you want to play with this right now, what you can do is close your eyes, put your two hands near your ear again, and slowly kind of open up one of the hands a little bit, or kind of angle it differently. If you want to look, you can see what I'm doing. Do it slowly like waves, like the speed of waves. Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. I feel like I'm in Hawaii. Oh, it's relaxing. I feel like there should be like kind of birds in the background. I smell the sea air, but I'm easily amused. Anyway, what's really going on there with the shell, with your hands, is you're amplifying what's called the ambient sound. So ambient sound in this context really isn't very much more than the very quiet sounds that are around you. There's nothing really loud, right? In a quiet room, right? And this is, I have this term seashell resonance on here, if you're interested. And what this is doing, basically, the seashell kind of captures the about the same, kind of acoustic frequencies as the ocean. Is just kind of this nice coincidence, and that allows you to hear the amplified ocean waves coming in. So it's not as if of course, the spirit of the ocean is not in the seashell, or the recording of the ocean is not in the seashell. We'll say the spirit is. But what you're really hearing is an amplification of the waves coming in, just like, and you don't have to have a seashell, you can use your hands, and don't tell your own kids that. Tell them it's the spirit of the ocean, but still. But that's really interesting because those very quiet ambient sounds can, in many cases, be enough to do some echolocation. Okay. Now, before I kind of portrayed the situation in which people's footsteps were needed for echolocation, and or some sort of notable sounds, some sort of clicking sound or some sort of beep or noise coming out of a loudspeaker. Yeah, that's where you're going to do your most accurate echolocation, especially if you're making yourself in a tight position. But there are examples, experimental examples, where people can actually do some echolocating, or I should say, maybe more accurately here, perception of reflected sound just from the quiet sounds in a room. So there are quiet sounds in this room. I'm not really in front of a waterfall, if you haven't figured that out. I'm actually in a bedroom right now, and there are quiet sounds from my fan. And those quiet sounds are potentially enough to reflect off the surfaces of this bedroom here and give my brain information as to where those walls, where those surfaces are. And so there, as I said, this has been shown experimentally where they would take blind individuals, and some of these experiments were done with blind children, and put them in very quiet rooms and tell them to take their shoes off and to be as quiet as possible, and determine based on that if anything was in front of them. Okay, so these are kids that had a little experience of echolocation, but they weren't experts at this point. Really, they didn't have a lifetime of practice like Daniel does as an adult. But based on the quiet sounds of the room reflecting off of different surfaces, they could do things like determine if there was a kind of panel of wood in front of them, a 4-foot panel, but even things that were thinner, like 6-inch cardboard strips that were kind of placed along or I guess kind of in a line down one of the rooms. They could walk along those cardboard strips without hitting them, not based on creating their own sounds, not based on any loud sounds in the room, just based on the ambient sounds that were reflecting off. And those ambient sounds, again, were things like the ventilation sounds. Maybe there was a little, people's clothes were moving a little bit. The kids' clothes were moving a little bit when they were moving, and that created a very quiet sound. So the idea of this, kind of emitting a sound and waiting for the reflections is kind of a nice way to learn the concept of echolocation. But I also think it's a little limiting, okay? Because you don't need anything so loud, and you don't need to generate the sound yourself. It helps, but you can still do echolocation without it being anything even noticeable. Right? By the way, I should just put this in. So these subjects could also, these blind children could also determine when they were coming to a corridor intersection as they were walking down hallways in, say a psychology building or something like that. They knew when they were coming to the intersections of the hallways. And as I said, they could walk along walls for guidance. Use the walls as guidance as they were walking down the hallways. Again, not making any sound themselves, any major sound themselves, but just based on how the walls reflected these very, very quiet, again, ambient sounds. And so what I'm saying here is, we've been thinking of echolocation as kind of sonar, right? That our subjects are kind of emanating sounds, and then those sounds are coming back. And we understand that bats do this, dolphins do this. And the metaphor there is, in all of those cases, is kind of a sonar metaphor, right? Like how ships send out signals to the, across the ocean, and those signals come back, and the sonar detectors on ships can tell when there's a submarine in front of them, or they can determine how deep the ocean is, or whether there's any sort of impediment to the ship's course, so it doesn't run on rocks or something like that. That is how sonar works, and it's not a bad metaphor for understanding our initial comprehension of echolocation. But I think it's limiting, because you don't need to be making the emanating sound, and you don't even need very much of an emanating sound at all. Emanating, I just mean, the sound that goes out. Okay? I think there's a better metaphor for echolocation. I don't want to confuse you. It's kind of a goofy name, but I think it's going to help you remember a little bit. So you're seeing there a still from Indiana Jones, and the fourth movie, I think it is, right? I can't remember what that's called. But what I'm putting it on there for, why I put it on the slide, is because it's an example where Indy and, what's the guy's name? Mutt, is that the character, are in a cave. And I think that's how we can kind of consider what goes on in perceiving sound reflections, being in a cave and exploring a cave with flashlights. And so say, they both, looks like they both have flashlights there, is that right? But say the kid's flashlight breaks after a while, and so he has to rely on Indy's flashlight, Indiana Jones's flashlight, to tell what's in the cave. So Indiana Jones is the one that has the emanating sort of energy here, and you know, Indiana Jones can look at things by pointing his flashlight and determine what's in the cave. Oh, there's rats, there's snakes, there's this idol I'm after, whatever. But so can his buddy Mutt. Okay, I guess it's his son, right? Because Mutt can look at the reflections of Indiana Jones's light too, right? He doesn't have control over the light. So Indiana Jones might have a better sense of what's in a dark cave by being able to control the light. But Mutt can still determine much of what's there. And that's how I think we can think of echolocation, is like people exploring the cave and using a light, but instead of a light, we're talking about sound. So I call this the splunker metaphor, which is not there to confuse you. Splunkers are just cave explorers. It's like, that is, if you look it up, that is the official term for a cave explorer. And the idea here is that we can think of echolocation as using the reflections of somebody else's flashlight, as long as there's some type of light source, at least enough light source to cause light reflections, we can determine what's in there, right? But now with sound, it's the same thing. We don't need to be making the sound, okay? We don't need to be controlling the sound. The sound doesn't need to be at our location. As long as there's a little bit of sound there, and now you know it can be this quiet ambient sounds of a room, there's going to be information for reflecting surfaces, sound reflecting surfaces. So the idea that you're listening for your own echoes gets us kind of some intuitions about it, but I think our ability to perceive objects through sound reflections, through how that object reflects sound, is much broader than that. And that's why I'm kind of bringing in a different type of metaphor for what's going on. And so what I'm saying is we are able to hear what I'm going to generally call here ambient acoustics. We're able to hear silent objects from how they reflect sound, even if we're not making the sound, even if we're not actively echolocating. As long as there is enough sound in the room, we are able to determine the position, the location of walls and something about the room. Now, I think one of the most interesting ways to understand how this is in fact true is by turning to our friends in Hollywood. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, as I said, one of the most exciting things for me when I was writing the book was to actually be able to interview people that had really special intuitions about these sort of principles in perceptual psychology. And of course, I've known Daniel for a very long time, and it was wonderful to bike ride with him again and spend time talking with him again. But I was able to meet these people who do sound design, sound engineering for TV and movies. And boy, are their intuitions interesting. I mean, they have, you know, they're not scientists, of course, but they have such good insights about how our brains use sound. And they are the first folks to tell you that, you know, it's very important that what you see on the screen matches what you hear, okay, about that scene. So they talk about a lot about this. So basically we're going to now go into a section of our discussion where we're going to kind of learn some lessons about how the brain hears from how Hollywood works. I think you're going to find this really fun. I interviewed 3 or 4 of these folks, and they all said the same thing. Their goal is, as sound engineers, as folks that have to capture the sound of scenes that are being filmed, and in some cases actually replicate the sound of scenes being filmed, is their job is to, they use the term, keep the audience in the scene. What does that mean, keep the audience in the scene? You know, in normal times, they would be working mostly to do this in a movie theater, right? Be interesting to see if people continue to go to the movies after quarantine. I'm not quite sure it's been settled yet. I don't know if you folks have gone to the movies. Have you gone back to a theater? Let me know at some point if you gone back to a theater and you think, boy, I could see myself doing this regularly. I have not gone back to a theater just because it's so convenient to watch movies at home now. I'm very convinced of that. But maybe there are some movies that are worth seeing in a theater. We'll have to figure that out over the next few years. But they typically, certainly when I was interviewing them, they wanted to make sure that the theater space allowed the audience to feel like they were part of the scene. They were in the same space as the actors, right? So this is true not only of a movie theater. This is true of your home theaters too. Especially if you're either you have a nice surround system in your living room. They're working to make the sound in your home theater sound allow you to feel like you're in the same space as the actors. Or I listen to a lot of TV late at night, so I don't bother my wife. I listen to a lot of TV with headphones, and it's amazing how great the sound is when you listen through headphones. And yes, you do kind of feel like you're in the same space as the actors. So if you're watching Indy and Mutt in that cave scene, you kind of have a feel like you're in the same space. And that's a very important goal for these folks in Hollywood, okay? Especially the sound engineers. They want the audience to feel like they're in the same general location. Now, of course, it's not like we're completely fooled. Even with the 3D goggles on and everything, we know that we're in a theater, we're in our living room, right? Whatever. But there's kind of a psychological way in which you kind of can be made to feel like you're there with the characters. Okay? You were there with the characters. And what they'll tell you, not just the folks that work on sound, but the folks that work on the visuals, which we'll be talking about later in the course, they don't want you to be taken out of being engaged with the action on screen. They don't want there to be a mistake. Right. So, this sort of thing happens, right? You're watching a movie at home and then all of a sudden you get a text message or something like that. That's maybe the most obvious way that this can happen, where you're kind of taken out of the scene. And there's nothing they can do about that. These sound engineers, these folks that work on the visuals as well. There's nothing they can do about the distractions that might actually occur in your home as you're watching a film, or occur in the theater as you're watching the film. But they can take care of any mistakes that occur through the sound of the movie or through what you're seeing, right? And so, for example, here's right. So this is of course portraying a distraction in the theater. By the way, when cell phones first came out, you folks are too young to know this, but when cell phones first came out, people didn't turn them off in the theater. For a few years, cell phones would ring all the time in the theaters, and eventually, before there was a kind of cell phone decorum, they'd have to remind you to turn your cell phone off when you went into the theater. So this would happen all the time in the very beginning with cell phones. People wouldn't just get calls which you would hear ringing; they'd start talking in the theater, and it doesn't happen anymore, luckily. But that would certainly take you out of the scene, right? As would any distraction at your home as you're watching a movie. But there's also ones that can happen in the movie, and you maybe know a little bit about, folks that are responsible for making sure that if a scene is being depicted in New York City, but it's actually being filmed in Toronto, that there can be no reminders of Toronto in scene that you could see, right? That you don't want to see a building that says Toronto, Municipal Energy or something like that. You want to make sure that the audience is only seeing things that look like a generic city, so they can believe it's New York. That's the sort of thing that can take you out of the scene sometimes. Okay, make you less engaged and kind of make you very aware you're seeing a movie and all that sort of thing. Other sorts of glitches. This is from one of my favorite movies. It's considered one of the best terrible movies ever made, Plan 9 from Outer Space. The director of this movie, Ed Wood, was famous for just not caring about all the mistakes in the movie. And you can see there's a very visible kind of glitch in this, where they're supposed to be pilots in a cockpit. but you can see that shadow on top there. That's a shadow of the microphone that is recording the dialogue of these two actors. You know, that can make it very visible. Actually, it's fun. It's fun to watch this movie just because he didn't care about this sort of thing. So you can kind of play a game and try to spot all the little kind of glitches that occur. But, you know, in you know, big budget movies, they do not want anything like this. And, you know, if in fact a microphone sneaks into the visual scene, they will have to remove it somehow or refilm the scene, something like that. What these folks that do sound engineering are most interested in, though, is being able to make sure that what the audience is hearing is what the audience is seeing. And sometimes we're very aware of this. So the soundtrack, what I'm saying here is the soundtrack must match the scene. And sometimes we're very aware that it doesn't. Now, it bothers me, for example, to watch a poorly dubbed film. Okay, this is the old Godzilla movies from the 60s and 70s were filmed in Japanese. The characters were mostly speaking Japanese. And when I was a kid, the version I saw was one where English dialogue was recorded on the film. And so you would basically see the lips not matching what you were hearing. We're better. I mean, I think Hollywood's better at this now. Back then, it was so conspicuous. It was comical. If you ever get a chance to look back on some of that, we're better at this now. Things seem to be a little bit more. The dubbing seems to be a little better, but it's not good enough for me. I'll tell you right now. I cannot watch a dubbed film, and I do watch a lot of foreign series on Netflix and Amazon Prime. There's one that my kids watched, you know, that I think is used in Spanish classes called Money Heist. You know this? Very, very popular. And you can see it, it's a Spanish show. You can see it in two versions. It's great, by the way. If you have a chance to see it. I think it's the American version is called Money Heist. It's not a great title. And I think the Spanish version translates to House of Paper. But it's great fun. It's really a fun series. I began watching it dubbed, and meaning that, you know, American actors dubbed in the lines, and it bothered me. It bothered me enough that I found it distracting, not being able to see the dialogue, the audio dialogue match up with the visible, you know, mouth movements of what the lips were doing. And so I moved to, you know, the subtitle version, and now I watch pretty much every foreign show with subtitles. I can't really watch the dubbed versions, even though you have both on Netflix and Amazon Prime. It is just too distracting. I can't get engaged with the plot. I can't feel empathy with the characters if I'm being distracted by poor dubbing. Okay, that's an example. But what I want to be talking about now are examples where there's a mismatch potentially between what is seen and what is heard, not in terms of dialogue dubbing, but in terms of reflected sound. So I'm going to introduce you to somebody in just a second. That's going to show us that our brains are exquisitely sensitive to how rooms structure sound. And here's what I mean. Here's a sound stage. Wait, where's the picture? There it is. Okay, right there. Okay, so that's a studio lot, I think on the Warner Brothers lot. Soundstage. And as you can see, it's a little hard to see there, but it looks like it's a kind of a bedroom scene, and that is going to be where the filming is. So, you know, after it's filmed there, you would see a scene of two people speaking in a bedroom, right? And, you know, you can easily set the camera up, and, you know, set the walls up and all the furniture, and make sure the camera doesn't show anything beyond what the bedroom would look like. Okay, very simple thing to do with cameras. You just don't point the cameras beyond the set, right? However, during the recording of the dialogue in the bedroom, the sound engineers need to make sure that it sounds like those people are speaking in the bedroom. And that is a challenge. Why? Because very often the scene's depicted sound, a bedroom, okay, does not match the actual sound on the sound stage, on the set, right? So this could be what ultimately you'll want to see and hear, but the actual space this is being filmed in and the sound is being recorded in is much larger. So imagine how the dialogue would sound in this space, right? I don't know if you've ever taken a tour of, I don't know, does Universal still do regular tours? But the Warner Brothers lot's great. I mean, I had some friends from out of town recently visit, and we did the Warner Brothers lot tour, and they really, really kind of teach this stuff. It's really interesting. Paramount, I think, also does one. So if you get a chance to do these if you haven't. But this is what it looks like. This is exactly what it looks like. I think this one is on the Warner's lot, as I said. That the spaces are humongous. They are huge. And you can imagine how dialogue sounds in there. It would sound like two people talking in a gymnasium or an airplane hangar or something like that. There'd be so many echoes, right? And that's going to be a problem. If they're supposed to sound like they're in a bedroom, but they sound like they're in a gymnasium, that's going to be distracting, right? And sound engineers know this, and they are aware of how exquisitely sensitive our brains are to this fact. So the problem is the depicted scene, like the bedroom scene's acoustics, aren't going to match the soundstage's acoustics. The soundstage is huge. It's like a gymnasium. The depicted scene needs to be a very closed, quieter space without all these echoes. So these sound engineers must come in to that space and change it so the sound in that space sounds like a bedroom. Okay, the acoustic space must be modified. And we'll introduce you now to Jay Patterson, who is what's called a sound mixer. And that's just his official title. He does a lot of things. But the thing I was most interested in is how he modified the space of a set so it sounded like it looked. And I talked to Jay about this, and he said, you know, this is something that you learn right away in this business, that every space you go into has what he calls an acoustic signature. And I really like that term, an acoustic signature, right? Whatever space you're in right now as you're listening to the lecture has an acoustic signature. And what he means by that is that it reflects the sounds in that room in a very specific way, right? And I think the example I give in the book is, you know, walking into your closet and closing the door and, you know, clapping your hands or saying testing 1, 2, versus going into a locker room or a gymnasium or something like that, or even your bathroom and speaking, right? Let's just go with your bathroom, right? Your bathroom has hard tiles all over it, and it's going to reflect the sound of your voice differently than your closet will, which doesn't have very many hard surfaces. Most of the surfaces in there are soft clothing surfaces. And so you know that sounds are different in your closet versus your bathroom. And that's a very kind of extreme example. There's a different sound signature in your bathroom versus your closet. But Jay says that's true of all rooms. And when we see a room, when we look at, you know, film of a room that's, you know, depicting a scene, our brains know something about how that room should sound. And if it doesn't sound like that because of what the real space is, the gymnasium-sized, airplane-sized sound stage, then, you know, we're in trouble. So what Jay needs to do is go to the sound stage and determine how to, in fact, change the acoustics so that the space you're seeing in the scene sounds like it should. Okay. And what he says he does is he goes on to the set and stands in the middle and does a single hand clap. You know, he's been doing this for so long, it just takes a single hand clap, like that. And he is able to tell how the sound space needs to be modified. So think back to the picture I just showed on the previous slide of this humongous vaulted ceiling sound stage, which is going to have all these echoes, but he needs to make that small space sound like a bedroom. He'll go to the middle of the set, the bedroom set, clap his hands once. He says, oh my gosh, we got a lot to do here. We need to put blankets here and there. We need to put something above here, and probably you know, some sort of wall that's going to hang somehow from the ceiling or be suspended from some sort of anchors, you know, some sort of device. We're going to have to put a lot of soft surfaces around here, and by doing that, we're going to make this humongous space, at least in this location here, sound like a bedroom. And so that's exactly what he does. He uses baffles, which are kind of, actually there were some baffles in that slide that you just saw. They're basically like rollable walls, you know, that can be added to the scene, and blankets. He needs to do this. It's actually interesting. I mean, this is why, you know, it's not that easy a job. First of all, you can imagine that's a bit of a challenge to be able to go in there and clap once and say, this is what we need to do very quickly. He needs to do it quickly because it needs to occur while the camera folks are setting up. And he needs to do it in such a way that none of these things he's adding to the set, these blankets, these baffles, are going to be visible by the camera, right? He's got to change the sound in a very precise way, but in a way that it has to be hidden from the camera. It takes a lot of experience to be able to do this well. And then once he does that, he'll make sure that he is able to kind of capture how those acoustics are now molded by what he's doing by putting lots of different microphones around the room. So to record dialogue, we'll talk about how dialogue's recorded a little bit in a couple of slides. So people do have like these lapel mics often hidden on their bodies, but they also use mics that are suspended, like the mic you saw the shadow of in that crappy Plan 9 movie before. But what Jay also does is he puts little microphones around the room to basically capture the room's reflections. And all that is kind of put together in his recording that is then used when the scene is ultimately, you know, edited for the film or the TV show. And Jay's, I should mention, I mean, some of his movies are listed. I'm sure he's done a lot of stuff. I should probably look up his IMDb, more recent IMDb page to see what he's done over the last 10 years. But he's won, you know, Emmys and Oscars for the work he's done. He's been doing this forever, and he's very, very talented. He has a very successful company that does that on movies I'm sure you've seen. But you know, he's gotten terrifically good at being able to do this. And now, you know, this is quite, you know, this takes some talent, and it takes on his part, you know, some kind of very, very precise listening to be able to know how to shape the scene. But the big lesson here, I think, is that he is aware that if he doesn't do his job well, okay, that people are going to, whether consciously or unconsciously, be thrown out of the scene because, in fact, what people are hearing the room sound like does not match what people are seeing in the film scene. Those things don't match. It's one of those things that kind of takes us out of the scene. It makes us kind of less engaged with the action that's going on. And, you know, says that, you know, maybe people aren't always conscious of why they're distracted or why they lose their concentration in a movie or a TV show, but that is certainly one of the reasons. And I think all the sound engineers I've talked to have said this, and all, you know, I've talked to some of the visual folks too, some of the directors, and they say the same thing, that even if we're not consciously aware of being distracted by poor kind of matching between the reflected sound that's heard and the scene that is actually visible on the film, then it is the sort of thing that disengages the audience. Okay? So this is why they make you know, lots of money doing this, and they dedicate a lot of money to this, you know, more than I think Spielberg and George Lucas have said that, you know, 50% of a movie is the sound, even if you're not quite aware of how important it is. And it's not just good recording of dialogue and the music and all that stuff. It is good sound where you feel like you're in the space that you're seeing. Okay. Let's take our little break here, and we'll do, not break, real break where we're leaving the room, but let's do a question. All right, so we'll stop sharing. All right, let's see, are there questions? Oh, okay, let's see here. So people have responded, Ivy, and Yaya, excited, Yaya, hater. Okay, oh, that show is, okay, so are you responding to, well, it looks like you're responding to different things. I think when you say that show is awesome, you're responding to Money Heist. Yeah, it's really great. My kids were assigned to watch it for their Spanish class in high school, and they became real fans. It's just a fun show. But I mean, I don't know if other people have that experience of watching dubbed shows. I can't just do it anymore. Of course, you know, in my laboratory, we study audiovisual speech perception, so I'm especially sensitive to when lips don't match sounds. So that's one thing. But I think I'd much rather read the subtitles. Anyway, okay, let's do, if there's questions, feel free to ask at any point, or any comments or anything like that. But if not, let's do one of our polling questions. And I think I fixed the problem. Oh my gosh. Maybe not. Okay. Good. Okay. All right. It's a question from last lecture. And I will read it first, and then I'll give you a minute. Then I'll launch the poll and allow you to respond. And then we'll talk about the answer. So when an echolocator is less than 2 meters from a sound reflecting surface, which type of acoustic cue is he/she probably using most? A, time delay between emitted and reflected sound. B, intensity ratio between emitted and reflected sound. C, ripple noise pitch. Or D, both A and B are correct. Okay, I'll give you about a minute to answer this. Again, there's no ramifications for how you do on this. It's not being recorded. It's completely anonymous. It's just a way for us to practice some questions and to know some questions as for the test. Okay. Give you another half minute or so. You don't have to answer, but all right. About half of you have answered. All right, that's okay. I think that's good enough. The correct answer is in fact C, ripple noise pitch. And just so you remember this, we talked about while the cues of time delay between emitted and reflected sound and the intensity ratio between emitted and reflected sound is usable when you're further than 2 meters away from the surface that you're echolocating. It happens to be the case that the brain really can't use those cues anymore when you're closer to 2 meters because it can't resolve the time differences, the return time differences, or the return intensity differences. So we must be using another cue, and it's thought that that other cue is this ripple noise pitch that we demonstrated with a sort of sound, where the sound that is returning interferes with the sound that is emitted, And the way that changes is very likely how our brains are able to determine there's something within 2 meters of us, and we can stop before we get there without bumping into it. Okay. Are there any questions about this poll question? Anything? Okay, feel free to either speak up or ask on chat. Cool. All right, we'll do some more questions as the lecture goes on today. All right. So if there's nothing else, I think we're okay. All right, then I will share my screen again. And there we go. Shoot, I did not mean to do that. All right, hold on a second. Sorry, everybody. There I am. Scary big. Okay, so that's Jay Patterson's job. Now, once Jay's done with that, he does an amazing job. When it comes time for what we call post-production, where things need to be kind of tweaked a little bit, things need to be modified a little bit, he gives it to what's called the sound designer. And those are the folks that are responsible for everything having to do with the sound of a film after the recording and the mixing. That doesn't involve music. Music is something that comes afterwards. And I had a chance to talk to a very famous sound designer whose name is Sandy Berman. And there he is right there. Wonderful guy. Really interesting. And what Sandy is responsible for, sound designers is his official title. As I said, it really is everything sound related after the recording is made, after the sound recording is made. And he doesn't write the music, but he adds sound effects, and he does something called looping. Now, so what I have here is he does post-production Foley and looping. We're going to learn more about Foley in just a second, but Foley is just the name for sound effects, adding sound effects to a film. Okay, it's named after one of the first folks who did sound effects in film, whose last name was Foley, James Foley or something like that. And when he was doing it, he was kind of using things on a table. I don't know if you've ever seen how old-fashioned sound effects were done. But basically, if you want to, create a horse sound, a horse's running sound, you would use coconuts on that table, that sort of thing is pretty charming. So those are all the sort of sound effects that people used to use. Now we know that that there's you can have computers that have pretty much almost any sound effect that you want on them, and you can add those the files on the sound files on a computer to the visual film, and that's often how it's doing. So that's sound effects. We'll be talking more about that in a second, I think. But looping is what I want to talk about now. And looping is kind of an odd term, kind of like Foley. Looping is the term used to re-record dialogue from the actors. So it is almost always the case. Certainly in films, it is absolutely always the case. And in most TV shows, it is the case that regardless of how well someone like Jay Patterson does in the recording of the dialogue, okay, something's going to be needed to be corrected. And it could be because, I don't know, the way an actor maybe mumbled a line, or maybe they were turning as they were saying a bit of dialogue or something like that. It just didn't come out clear. So what they do is they bring back the actors and they bring them to Sandy's studio, and they have to restate the dialogue. Okay, it's like dubbing, except the reason it's called looping is this. The way this typically works is the actor comes in to the studio, and on one wall there is a giant screen, and they see themselves on the screen saying the line that needs to be re-recorded. So, you know, imagine here I am, Brad Pitt, okay, who I get, you know, confused with a lot. You know, saying, I mumbled a line during Ocean's 11 or something like that, right? So I have to come back in and I have to say that line. And so what I will see is a film clip of myself saying the line, which I will then try to say synchronously with the film I'm seeing. Now that film is on a loop, and so I have a chance to say it again and again as I'm being re-recorded, and that's why it's called looping. It's kind of a really distracting name in some ways. It's really basically redubbing, right? Okay, but what I was interested in and what Sandy got me interested in was how important when doing that new recording, that not only does it have to sync up, right? That's what Brad Pitt has to do. He has to, you know, sync his spoken dialogue, that spoken line, with the way he said it when the scene was originally filmed, so it matches the lip movements and all that sort of stuff. That takes, you know, some practice, some talent, and Sandy needs to be there as kind of a way of directing him to help him with that. Sandy also needs to do this. He needs to make sure that when he is re-recording Brad in his studio, that it is going to sound like the space that the original scene was filmed in. So imagine this scene of dialogue was filmed in a casino, right? So there are sounds in the back, of course, you know, all the slot machines, all those noises, everything that a casino has. So what he's going to have to do ultimately is actually add those sounds to the new recording he's making of that line of dialogue, okay? But more than that, he has to make sure that when Brad Pitt says that line in the studio, that the sound reflections are also being captured. Okay, that the sound reflections are also. So let's move it out of the casino. This is a line of dialogue he has in the hotel room. Okay, so it's much quieter. And as I remember, they're in a hotel. There's scenes in hotel rooms that are, you know, kind of nice sized suite hotel rooms. You know, that they're kind of fancy. Okay, and the original dialogue and the original film scene is filmed in that room. And so now Brad has to come back to a space, the studio, that's probably at least much bigger, okay, than the room that it was originally filmed in. And what Sandy needs to do is make sure that that new dialogue sounds like it was spoken in the same room that the original scene was filmed in. Okay, so he needs to recreate the reflected sound in his studio. How does he do that? Well, there's different ways. And I said, well, why would you use different ways? He says it all comes down to budget, right? It all comes down to budget. And I said, well, can you give me an example? He said, yeah. Sandy, when he first started off, worked on kind of low budget TV shows, soap operas, things like that. So, well, how would you then make this redubbed, this loop, new dialogue sound like it was in the original scene? And he said, well, the cheapest way is probably this. It's called room tone recordings. This is how it works. After a scene is filmed on any movie or any TV show, okay, before they leave that space to go to another space to film something, they have everybody stand where they were during the dialogue. So I'm in my scene with Angelina Jolie, as it's in the book, right? And I'm talking with her, and after I'm done with my line of dialogue and she's done with her lines of dialogue, this is in the original filming, of course, and we're in the original space. We both then just kind of stand there exactly where we were when we were speaking. And they come in with that kind of apparatus of microphones you're seeing there on the slide. It looks like it's pointing 4 ways. Sometimes it's a little fancier. And they will record the quiet ambient sounds of the room. Okay? And that's what room tone is in this context. That's what they mean by room tone. So they'll come in and no one's supposed to say anything. You know, Angie and I are just, you know, kind of standing there breathing. But there's ventilation sounds, as you know, right? There could be other sounds like maybe from fluorescent lights or something like that. And a minute of silence, essentially silence, is recorded, okay, in that room. Nobody can make any sound at all. It's, you know, a little unnerving as I understand it. And then what they do is they take that recording, and if I then have to come back as Brad Pitt and redo that line of dialogue, what they'll do is they'll take the room tone recording and add it to my newly recorded line of dialogue, okay? And it does a pretty good job of making me, as Brad Pitt, kind of sound like I was in the original room. But that's not the best way. And in fact, you know, what Sandy says is, you know, for TV shows, if you're not listening carefully, it's okay. The new dialogue will kind of sound like it's in the original space, right? He says that he can usually tell as he's watching TV if in fact it's a different, you know, it was redubbed, if in fact it's room tone recording that was used, okay? So, all right, so what if you have a little bit more money, Sandy? What are you going to do? And he goes, well, if I have enough money, I might actually go back to the original space it was recorded in, not with the actors, because that can be very, very expensive to bring them back to the original space, but with the newly recorded line of dialogue, a recording of the line of dialogue. So he gave me this example. I think it's called El Cantato. Oh, I can't remember. It's the movie with Jennifer Lopez and Mark Anthony, where they were in a movie together. I don't know very much about the plot. I saw the movie a long time ago. Maybe you folks know it. I don't know if you're Jennifer Lopez fans. It's supposed to be a pretty good film. He worked on that. Sandy worked on. He was the sound designer on that film. And there was a scene where they get married, and it was filmed in Mexico, I believe, on this beautiful plaza, kind of enclosed sort of plaza that was surrounded by these beautiful, you know, tile mosaics and all that's, you know, just, you know, kind of very old, you know, kind of Mexican architecture. They said it was just absolutely beautiful. And that's where the original, you know, scene of the wedding was filmed, and that's where all the dialogue was filmed. And inevitably, you know, Jennifer Lopez had to come back and redub a little of the dialogue. That's just, you know, how it happens with all movies and TV shows. And what they did is they had her come back to the studio. They recorded her doing the dialogue as she was watching herself say the dialogue, made sure everything was synchronous and everything. And then what they did is, in order to recapture the very, very, I guess, specific acoustic signature, sound signature of that plaza in Mexico, they him and another person flew back to that space and basically put loudspeakers around that space, that plaza, and presented her dialogue through the loudspeakers into that space, and then recorded how that space changed the dialogue. Now you see, you're getting a sense now for how picky these people are and how much they believe if they don't do this well, you're not going to feel like you're really in the space with them. So, you know, let's think of the big picture here. What they want is that during that scene, that wonderfully romantic scene between Jennifer Lopez and Mark Anthony, that, you know, you want to feel like you're there. And therefore, the sound that you're getting needs to make you feel like you're in that space with them. You know, when Jennifer Lopez comes back into the studio and has to re-record the dialogue, it ain't going to be good. The acoustic, you know, kind of the reflections, the sound signature in the studio is not going to be the same as this glorious kind of plaza. So he actually had money enough to fly back there for a couple of days with his friend, set this up, and kind of re-record the new dialogue that Jennifer had to, you know, create in that space. So it came out of the loudspeakers and bounced around all that space in the plaza. They recorded that, came back, and he said it worked really nicely. It really, really did work nicely. Okay. All right. And that is called what he calls worldizing. That's what he means by worldizing, is actually going back to the original location and playing the playing the newly recorded dialogue that was captured in the studio. Okay, so now you have that dialogue that's again being shaped by the acoustic signature, the sound signature of that very space. So that works pretty well. However, there's other ways of doing it. He said, yeah, these days, we have some technology that works. And it's called the convolution. The technology is convolution. And it's, I don't care about, you the name is a little confusing, but basically what he could do, he said, another way, if in fact he wanted to, if there were many scenes that had to be done re-recorded in that space, and he had already gone back once, and it turns out they have to go back again. If they feel like they're going to have to add the acoustic, the sound signature of that plaza, many times without having to go back and forth, he flew there just assuming that it was just that those Jennifer Lopez lines that needed to be recaptured down there. But now maybe they flew back and say, oh my gosh, we brought Mark Anthony in and we have to redo this. We have to go back there. Again, rather than doing that, what he can do is actually take measurements of that space in Mexico, right? He can go ahead and basically just measure distances between walls, kind of record, kind of take pictures of the materials in that room. And that information can be put into a computer program that can then modify the sounds that are put through the program. So any new sound put through that program will, by this kind of process, this mathematical process, make a new recording sound like it was in fact recorded in that space. So there are ways of computationally, mathematically, making a sound seem like it was in that space. It's actually the sort of thing that musicians can do to some degree. Sound engineers that are working on music can add effects to make it sound like you're in a stadium, or add effects that make it sound like you're in a coffee shop. And I'm not talking about the sound, the emanating sounds. I'm talking about the reflected sounds of a small space versus a humongous space of an auditorium or a stadium or something like that. But what this does, this convolution process does, is it actually takes the information about the specific dimensions and reflecting surfaces of a specific space, in this case, the Plaza in Mexico. Okay. He said, that's great. It's working better and better. We're starting to do that. If we have a nice budget, we can, really kind of enhance the program to do a pretty good job. He said, but what I really want to do as much as I can, Sandy said, is to actually recreate the space. So what do you mean? He said, I want to, when the looper comes in, the actor comes in to do their looping, is actually have them re-say the line in a space that has at least tried to capture most of the acoustics from the original scene. So what he would have preferred to do when he brought Jennifer Lopez in to redo that line is to literally recreate the space. He says what he'll do is, if he has the budget, he didn't for this movie, but depending on what the space is, if the budget allows this, he could have recreated just acoustically what that space was when he brought her back and had her redo the dialogue. Okay. So what would that mean? Well, it'd have to be a big space, and he'd have to have, some walls that he was able to affix tiles to, and maybe put, ceramic tiles on the floor too, and have her come in and actually do the looping, actually, do the recording of the fixed line in that space. Okay. And he'll do that, by adding blankets and baffles and all the sort of things that J. Patterson does, but the baffles, these walls, these reflectors will have to have the same type of material as the walls that were used in the real space. That was going to be very hard for the Jennifer Lopez Mark Anthony scene, because that would have been very, very expensive to recreate the space. But you know, he wants it to be as real as possible. He kept on saying, you know, there's just nothing like the real thing. If you can get the actors to actually say the line in the same acoustic space, it doesn't have to be the same literal space, the same acoustic space, then that's when you're going to have your best dubbing. Okay? So why do you want them to actually say, why can't they say the line in the studio and you bring it out there? Or you say they say the line in the studio, regular, you know, sound stage, and then you add things computationally to it. He says, because the actor is going to say the line a little different depending on the acoustics of the space. Really? So, yeah, they might not know they're doing that, but they do. You know, if in fact, you know, I was able to recreate the you know, the hard ceramic tiles of that plaza when Jennifer redid her line, she would have said it just a little bit differently. Okay? Probably in a way that was a little bit more like the original filming. Wow. Okay. Yeah, I noticed these sorts of things, and this is something. Oh yeah, never mind. Before I get that, I didn't need to do that yet. Yeah, I didn't actually put this on the slide, but she said that every once in a while I'll have an actor that notices this sort of thing. That, you know, they're in, when they're redubbing their dialogue, they'll feel like it's too sterile a place acoustically, sound-wise, it's too sterile a place for them to be doing this, the dialogue there. And so what I'll do sometimes is I'll maybe play them a little of that room tone recording, if in fact I have one or something like that, because they know that, you know, it's subtle, but they will say things differently depending on the space they're in. And yes, I mean, in some ways this is very intuitive to us. You know, if there's a lot of background sound, we'll talk louder, all that sort of thing. But if it's an echoic space, especially that plaza with all the ceramic tile in it, where it was probably a little echoey, right? People speak a little bit differently, and it can be a very subtle thing, but it's something that actors sometimes will notice. Just most people don't notice the difference. But every once in a while, I will have an actor notice. I don't know if you know Robert Duvall. He's an older actor. He was in the Godfather movies, if you know those. And he said that he worked often with him in doing looping and things like that. And he said Robert Duvall always would notice. He'd always have issues with this, where if he saw the scene on the screen and it was in a very different space from the space of the studio, he would have problems. He said, you know, I don't feel like I can act as well if I'm not in the space that the film is originally set in. And so what Sandy Berman would do with Robert Duvall is actually recreate the space acoustically as much as possible. And Robert Duvall was very appreciative of that, which is interesting. Again, the lessons here we're building up is that our brains are really sensitive to how rooms structure sound, even if we're not completely conscious of it, which is kind of cool. All right, let's talk a tiny bit about some of the research that's been done on this. And I'm just going to present a couple of experiments that we did in the old days to give you an idea of how research is done on this type of thing. And this is this is an early experiment. So what we did, we were interested in whether people can recognize rooms based on sound, based on how they reflected sound. And you know, I think it's fun to present this because this was done in rooms on the campus, on UCR campus. So maybe you'll recognize some of these rooms. But the question we asked is, can we recognize rooms based on how they structure emitted sound? So that's the important thing to remember as I discuss this. We're not interested in whether you can recognize a room based on the sounds that happen to be emitted inside of it. So, you know, as you look at those rooms, you know, the sounds in a basketball court are typically going to be different than the sounds in the classroom and the sounds in the bathroom. That's the last little room you see down there is a little laboratory room. I believe all these rooms are labs in Olmsted. So this is the bathroom in the basement of Olmsted, near where our own laboratory is. This is a classroom on the first floor of Olmsted. This is a little laboratory room in our own lab. And this is the gymnasium. This is the old gymnasium, which I believe is still there in the old gym. I don't know if it's been renovated into something else. I haven't been in there in years. But this is the one that's kind of near the Commons, not the big stadium where the big, court where the actual team now plays. But we loved it because it was a huge space, and we thought, boy, since this had not been tested previously about whether people can actually recognize rooms by the way they sound, we thought this is a nice room to use. Now, what's important here is, yes, as I said, you could go into these spaces and you could probably, if you were blindfolded, you could determine something about which space you were in, because the sounds that are made in each of these spaces are different, right? So if you're here and it's a classroom, you'll hear students milling around. Here you might hear basketballs bouncing. Here you might hear faucets, a toilet flushing, or something like that. Well, we're not interested in that. We're interested in if the same exact sound is made in each of these rooms, okay, would you still be able to tell which room you were in based on how that sound was reflected in the room, how that sound kind of bounced around the walls of the room and then reached your ears? Would you be able to tell that sort of thing? That's what we were interested in. So we had 4 rooms. And we used a loudspeaker to emit the sound. So that's what you're seeing there in the top image, or not the top of the image, this image right here. Yeah, okay. That's a little loudspeaker. And in each of the rooms, we had the loudspeaker positioned in the same location relative to where the microphones were, all right? The microphones, though, were a special type of microphone. You might be interested in this, those of you that are interested in sound recording and music recording, that sort of thing. We used a type of recording technique called binaural recordings. And what binaural recordings are recordings made with 2 small microphones that are positioned in ear canals. Now, the way we did it is we actually had somebody stand there with little microphones in their ears, one in the left ear, one in the right ear, and recorded the sound in these rooms based on that. Sometimes this is done not with a real person, sometimes it's done with a mannequin head or something like that. I don't know if you've ever seen these sorts of things on the internet. Sometimes music recording, concert recordings are sometimes made like this now. And what that does is when you listen to those recordings through headphones, you are able to get a spatial sense of the space in which those recordings were made, not just left and right like stereo gives you, but up and down and forward and back and distance very, very well. Why? Because having microphones positioned in ear canals allows the sound that's coming in to be structured by our ears, our ear flaps, okay, they're called the pinna, these little flaps of ears on the outside of the head, as well as a head, which actually structures sound, and a body. And all of those things, especially the ear flaps, will allow sounds to seem much more precisely located in a recording. I don't know if you folks have ever heard recordings like this. I'll post an example of a binaural recording that's kind of fun. It's kind of a fun little play. I guess it's a kind of silly little play where a recording is made of you, the person with the headphones, getting a haircut, and you can hear the barber kind of walking around you as they're speaking. There's music playing on one side. People are coming in and out of the door, I believe, and then the razor, which is just tremendous, comes close to your ears, and you can feel almost the razor on your head. It's so kind of striking. And what's really amazing is when you're doing this is you have a good sense of where things are in the front and back and side and all that sort of thing. Okay, so that's how we did the recording. So we took those recordings, went back to the laboratory, and then played them to subjects. So I actually have some recordings. Now, I don't know if you folks are listening over your computer or you're listening over your earbuds, AirBuds, or whatever they're called. This demonstration does work a little bit better if you have headphones or earbuds or whatever, but it's not critical you do it. So again, I've got a recording here of sounds that were emanating from a loudspeaker that was positioned here. Just about 6 feet in front of the binaural microphones that were in a person's ears. And the sound, by the way, is just what we call a white noise sound. It's but you're going to hear it 5 times. It goes and that's going to be the sound you're going to hear throughout these different stimuli. But they were recorded in different rooms. And let's see if you can tell which rooms the different sounds were recorded in. Here's the first one. Oops. Sorry, let me play that again. All right, there's the first one. I'm assuming you guys can hear that okay. I think I did share my sound. Just give me, I'll see. All right, I'll assume, let me know if you couldn't. Sorry, here's the second one. Sorry, I don't know why I stopped here in the middle. All right, let me play it again. This is the second room. So which room do you think that was recorded in? Here is the third room. Sorry. Okay. Any idea which room that was recorded in? And here is one of the other rooms. Okay. Don't forget, this is the same sound presented through a loudspeaker at the same distance in each of these different cases, but can you hear which room they were recorded in? Let me do this one more time as well. There's one room. Oh, sorry, do it again. We've got the bathroom, the classroom, then gymnasium, or the little laboratory room. Here's the second one. Sorry. Which room do you think that was in? The bathroom, the classroom, gymnasium, or laboratory room? Here's the next one. I can do this on my computer. It kind of depends on how good the sound is coming through to you right now, but I'm hearing very clear differences. And here's one more. Okay. So here is, in fact, I think I have the answer here. No. Wait, hold on just a second. Yeah, I'll give you the answer here while we're looking at this slide. It was, in fact, the case that the first room that you heard was, in fact, the bathroom. The second one was the classroom. The third one was the gymnasium. And the final one was the little laboratory room. You know, if you were listening with headphones, you might have been able to tell the gymnasium. The gymnasium is, if you're just coming through your computer loudspeakers, it probably didn't work as well. But it does sound different. If you listen very carefully now, hopefully you'll be able to hear that. There's the sound. There is actually a very long lecture. Okay. All right. So how do people do? People do amazingly well at this. And don't worry, I know this is our first graph. I don't, I'm just kind of showing it to you. The sound you just heard, just you can look right here, was right here. And what this is showing is that for the different sounds, people are amazing at picking this out. And they're doing it very, very quickly. They're doing it very quickly. Listeners are outstanding at doing this sort of thing. They really are. And then what we did is we actually cut out most of the sound and just played them a single little burst like that to see if they could do it. And then beyond that, we actually cut away the initial part of the sound and just played a single little echo piece. It was so tiny. They barely heard anything at all. It was like that. And told them that we were doing that. And people could still do it. I mean, all we need is a tiny little piece of sound to know something about the room a sound was recorded in. And I think it really kind of, supports the intuitions that Jay Patterson and Sandy Berman have about this sort of thing. Is that, yeah, our auditory brain is really sensitive to differences in how rooms reflect sound. And if there's something off about that in the films and the TV shows that they're helping create, that it is maybe distracting for our brains, even if we're not consciously aware of that fact. So it could be that, while you're watching a TV show, while you're watching a movie, and you find yourself distracted for a second, it might not be because of, something going on around you at the time, but the sound isn't quite good enough. The sound isn't good when it comes to matching matching the scene that you're seeing. Okay. All right, this is probably a good place to take a little break. So what I got, 11:33. So about 11:43, we'll come back and continue our lecture. Okay, see you in a couple seconds. All right. Hopefully most of you are back. I think this would be a good time to do another exam question. So let's do that. Okay. Just a second. Yes. This should be very simple. Now, this is going to be one of the easiest ones since we just went over this. That's okay. You get a free question. Here is your question. Which of the following are techniques to make looped or redubbed dialogue sound as if it's been recorded in the same room as the original scene? A, room tone recordings. B, worldizing. C, physically recreating the original room's acoustic space. Or D, all of the above. So I will give you a minute to go ahead and answer this. Too easy, but get a free question. All right. Anyone else want to answer? What are we doing here? Okay. Another 15 seconds or so. All right. The correct answer is the one that most of you got. It is all of the above. Room tone recordings is one way of doing it, the kind of cheaper way of doing it. Worldizing is more expensive, but at least according to Sandy, it works better. And then physically recreating the space is his favorite way of doing it. And so if somebody was answering the question that way, that would be the answer. However, it's a question about which of the techniques, which are techniques that do this, and they all do it. So it is true that physically recreating the space is at least for Sandy and some other folks I talked to, the way that they really prefer, but they all work. They all work and they're all used. So the correct answer for this question is D, all of the above, and that will be exactly how it's presented on your exam, your midterm exam. Okay. There we go. Cool. Any questions on that or anything else that we have been talking about today or anything else relevant to the course? No? Okay, then we can continue. And I'm noticing that the lighting isn't great on me today. This is not the usual room I do the lectures from, so things will look a little better next time. But I'm sure this is working well enough for today. All right, then let's continue our discussion of this. Oops. And we're going to move on from hearing rooms to something even more precise than that, even maybe in some ways more impressive than that. And that is the idea that not only can we hear what rooms we're in, but we can actually hear, in a way, where we are in a room based on how the room structures sound. Now, you can think about different ways you might be able to do this. Say that you were blindfolded, that headphones were put on you, and you were kind of brought into a room, and you were put someplace in the room, and then the headphones were taken off of you, and you were asked to determine where in the room do you think you are. Okay. You could listen for things in the room that are making sound, if there is anything making sound. Like a ventilation or something like that. You can say, well, I feel like I'm on the left of the ventilation, so I'm probably on the left side of the room or something like that. But imagine there's no other sound, and what you have to do is make your own sound. We're going to talk about whether or not you would be able to determine where you are in the room based on that type of scenario in just a second, based on an experiment we did to actually test that type of thing. But I wanted to first talk about this with regard to the sound engineering, the sound recording that Jay Patterson has to do. And let's talk about the situation. This is, sorry, it's backwards. This is forwards. Here's Jay. And Jay told me about this kind of interesting scenario that he has to deal with called ambient sound shift or ambient shift. An ambient shift is something that he needs to kind of refine how he's going to change the acoustics in a room in kind of a kind of idiosyncratic way. And what I mean by that is in a way that's going to have to kind of take care of how dialogue is recorded. Now, how is dialogue recorded? Well, we talked about the fact that, yeah, in fact, the actors do often have little mics hidden on their, body somewhere around their shirt, like this one, except it's smaller, not so conspicuous. But they're also recorded with those kind of older fashioned mics that are those things that hang down from the ceiling. And they find that for whatever reason, those mics really do the best job at capturing dialogue. So if you've ever seen a movie film, TV show filmed, there are many mics that are capturing the sound. Okay? But the one they want to use for capturing dialogue is the one that hangs down from above the actors. And what that mic does is it moves its direction around as different people speak. This is called a shotgun mic. And I just have a still there from an old show that Jay used to work on. He was working on it when I guess when I was interviewing him. I think it's called Without a Trace. These are the two actors that were the main stars of the film. And what he used to record them, besides all the little microphones he had around the set and the ones he had on their bodies, was this shotgun microphone. And that's what you're seeing right here. It's called a shotgun microphone for the obvious reason that it kind of looks like an old rifle or something like that. And that they still use. Even though it's kind of an old school technique, they find that it actually does record dialogue really well. And there is somebody who operates that microphone by kind of changing its direction depending on who's speaking. If this character is speaking, the microphone would be oriented towards her for her line of dialogue. And then when it's time for this guy to speak, the microphone would kind of shift around and point to him. Now, the thing about a shotgun microphone is it really only records in the direction the microphone is facing, okay? Or it best records, I should say that. It best records. So when it's pointed towards her, it's going to pretty much record the sound that it is pointing towards, and probably some sound behind her as well, okay? And it's not going to record much sound from the other side of the room at all. And then when it shifts back to point to him, it's going to be recording where it's pointing now, which would be towards him and the sound behind him, okay? But here's the issue for Jay, that not only does every room have a sound signature, every room location has a sound signature to it, okay? So if they're in an office, which it looks like they are in there are going to be different objects in different parts of the office. And those objects are going to structure the reflected sound differently than the objects on the other side of the room. Right now, don't tell anybody, but as I said, I'm not in a waterfall. I'm actually in a bedroom, and there's a bed right next to me, a big queen-size bed right next to me here. The sound reflections coming from this side of the room where the queen-size bed is are going to be different from the sound reflections that are coming from the other side of the room where more hard surfaces are, like the walls and windows and things like that, okay? That is something that that microphone is going to pick up, Okay, so it is the case that most every room is differentially reflective in different parts of the room. Okay, again, to my left is a big bed here. And so the sound reflections from this side of the room are different from the sound reflections from the other side of the room. And because shotgun microphones record kind of from a small area at a time, swinging the microphone back and forth could make it sound like the characters, the actors, are in two separate spaces. So shotgun microphones, that's what this is what I've been saying. This is just a little diagram that shows you that it's like a shotgun microphone is pointing in this direction. It's basically recording from the actor's position along with what's the sound structures that are behind the actor. So the actor's voice leaves their mouth and it kind of bounces off all the walls of the room, including what's behind them. But that structure behind them could be different. It could be, like a soft bed or something like that. Where then when the microphone goes to the other side, say of the room I'm in right now, I don't want to show you this room because it's my son's room and it's a little messy, but you can imagine what it's like. It would be recording the reflections of the hard surfaces of that room. Okay. So Jay needs to kind of balance out things so it sounds like the actors are speaking in the same room at the same time, and even during the scene, right? You don't want her voice to sound like it's in a bedroom and his voice to sound like it's in, I don't know, a locker room or something like that, because there's more reflections behind him. So he has to come in, and so it's basically we're talking here about the mic shift going back and forth. Oops. That the mic shifting back and forth, sorry about this, can cause the actor to sound if they're actually in different rooms. Okay? And he's got to then take care of that by actually equalizing the acoustics behind the actors. So if there is a bed behind the female actor there, that something like a soft surface needs to be added behind the male actor in order for there to be kind of an equal kind of structure, acoustic structure behind both actors, so it sounds like in the same room. Now, the question is, why doesn't that happen to our ears? And, so in other words, why, when we're, say, listening to two people talking in a bedroom, one's in front of a bed, the other's in front of hard surfaces, why doesn't that sound like they're in two different rooms? And the answer is because our ears are not shotgun microphones. Okay, our ears are getting all the sound from the whole room at one time. This is only a kind of artifact. What I mean is a kind of byproduct of having to use this microphone that is just aimed in a very specific part. So what it's nice, I mean, it's kind of a pain for poor Jay. He has to kind of add things to equalize the spaces acoustically behind the actors. But it's a really nice illustration of the fact that our auditory systems are not just sensitive to the acoustics of rooms, but are also sensitive to the acoustic of different locations in rooms and how those locations have different types of reflected sound. Okay. So now we can go to that demonstration I was talking about that I think you'll find interesting. Imagine you're in an experiment. This is something we ran in our laboratory many years ago. This is, it's going to sound torturous for our subjects, but it wasn't nearly as bad. They actually thought it was kind of fun. What we did is we needed to figure out a way of positioning them in different locations in a room without them knowing, where they were walking to. So we had to be the ones to move them around. So we had them sit on a little cart, and we had them put on blindfolds, and they actually had to put on little earmuffs so they couldn't hear us kind of moving them from one direction to another. And in addition, we had to kind of twirl them around so they couldn't remember where they were coming from. I mean, it sounds so torturous, but they didn't mind it. And then what we did is we put them in one of 9 different positions in the room. You know where it was? It was actually the classroom that you saw previously with all the chairs in it when we were recording different room acoustics. We took all the chairs out and brought our subjects on a cart into that room, and then we had them listen to themselves either making a sound or a sound being emanating behind them at those different positions. And so the only way they're able to do this is to listen basically to the sound reflections that occur in each of the different positions we put them in. And we put them in, and this is just the front left part of the room, the middle left part, the back left part, the center of the room, the back middle, front right, middle right, and back right. And we just asked, out of those 9 positions, where do you think you are right now? Okay. And what we did is, again, this is important. They can't do this by determining where they are relative to a sound that's being made. Okay, you know, right? So if we had the ventilation in the room on, and they could hear that the ventilation was in the middle of the room, and they say, well, I'm now hearing the ventilation over here, so I must be on the left side. Can't do that. We don't want them to do that way. Okay, we want them to do it based on the sound reflections at that location. And so what we did is we had that little loudspeaker you're seeing behind the subject there. Okay, the little loudspeaker here, make a sound. And that loudspeaker rolled around with them. So the loudspeaker always made this sound from right behind them. But based on that sound that came out, could they tell where they were based on how the reflected structure at the different positions changed the sound that was behind them? And so it's based on, clearly we have to do this based on room reflections, not sources. So basically we had to move this sound source with the listener. Oh, we also allowed them to do other things. We had them actually, besides this, we had an experiment where we had them actually speak out loud, basically echolocate. We had a little clicker they could push, but we had also noise bursts from the speaker, that sound that you heard before, that sort of sound. And what we found, especially with the noise bursts that were coming from the speaker, subjects could do this well. They weren't nearly as good. I'll be quite honest with you right now. They weren't nearly as good as they were to identifying which rooms the sounds were recorded in, like you saw before. But, chance here would be 1 out of 9, right? So what is it, 12% or something like that. And as you can see, especially with their voices and with the sound of the noise sequences and things like that, they were getting the correct position 50-60% of the time. So just by listening to how their location at any one time structured the sound through its reflections, that location's specific reflections, people could tell where they were. And if you think of this, maybe doesn't seem too strange. I mean, if you were to walk around your room, do you think you would be able to tell that you were in a corner because it sounds different than if you were in the middle? And I'm not talking about, where the sounds are coming from. They're always gonna be the same. So imagine you go testing 1, 2, testing 1, 2. Can you tell you're in a corner of the room versus in the middle based on how your voice is reflected back to you? And I think you'd have a good sense of where you were. Again, this is probably an unconscious thing. They're not necessarily doing this from, being conscious of analyzing the sound, but they had a feel for where they were in the room at fairly impressive levels. Given that chance was 12%, they were getting 60 and 70%. So I think Jay's point here is supported by this sort of experiment that, yeah, people aren't just sensitive to different kind of sound signatures of a room, but the sound signatures of the different locations in a room, which is pretty cool. Okay, cool, let's go on with this. All right, lesson 3, we are sensitive to when and how sounds are obstructed. And this is one of Sandy's things. Okay, so this is one of Sandy's points. And what he told us about now, not looping, but Foley recordings. Okay. So as I said, Foley is sound effects, right? And a lot of sound effects these days are in fact done with recordings that are saved on a computer. So, you have a car crash, often, no matter how well they try to record an actual car crash out in the, out on the set when they do it, it's going to probably need to be what they call sweetened up a little bit. And what they'll do is use the original recording of the car crash. But I don't know, I'm not sure if you've actually ever heard, I hope you haven't heard very many car crashes in your life, but car crashes in the real world don't sound a lot like car crashes in movies. Other things too. So punches in the real world, hopefully you haven't experienced that much either. In the real world don't sound very much like punches in movies, right? There's something kind of exaggerated about movie sounds. So, car crashes, I haven't heard many in my life, but it actually is much more of a dull sound. It's not like that sort of thing. So what Sandy will do during a car crash sound effect is he'll add some recorded crashing sounds, maybe glass crashing, maybe metal scraping, that sort of thing, to the original recording. Okay, he's got that sort of stuff on his computer. However, sometimes they need to revert to the old school sort of sound effects, the old school Foley effects. And that is interesting, especially important for sounds that we are very, very, I guess, familiar with. For example, footsteps. Okay? You cannot use recordings of footsteps that are kind of not synced up well to the original scene. People are very sensitive to the sound of footsteps. And how footsteps should go with the, kind of be synchronous with the footsteps that you're seeing in the scene, right? And also how footsteps sound in different environments. We are hearing our footsteps all the time. We are hearing other people's footsteps all the time. And so we know, it's very hard to fool us about what footsteps should sound like. And for that reason, when it comes time to, having to re-record footsteps, and they have to do this a lot still, no matter how great a job Jay Peterson does in recording the footsteps on the set, right? It's often the case they have to recreate these in the studio. And that's exactly what you're seeing here in this image right here. You are seeing them redubbing basically footsteps for a scene that's from a TV show or something like that. And so they'll get the scene and they'll listen to whether the footsteps are recorded well enough, and often they're not, they're just not clear enough. So what they'll do is they'll bring them into the sound studio and they will recreate them. And they have to be very precise here. They have to, first of all, if there's two characters, as this is showing, walking through, what is that, like a little park or something like that, then there have to be two people that are going to be, walking when they do the re-recording. Not only that, it looks like they're walking through on leaves through the park, and they have to bring something in here. So it sounds like these folks in the sound studio are in fact walking on leaves. Okay, cool, makes sense. I don't know, sometimes they use leaves, sometimes they use cereal. They use walking on cereal to recreate the sound of leaves, okay. But it gets even more complicated than that, because as say these people are walking together, they're talking, but they're also walking together. Those footsteps sounds have to sound very good. There are going to be times when these characters are walking behind objects. So for example, that's what I just put an image here of people walking down a street, and say you see two people talking, not from this angle, maybe the angle is more kind of directly facing them as they're walking. They are going to be walking behind things sometimes. In this case, they'd be walking, it looks like behind the base of some sort of light pole or something like that. In this scene, they might be, as they're walking, you might see them walk behind a very large tree trunk or something like that. When characters do that, the footsteps also need to sound like they are being heard from behind an object, right? If you hear the same footsteps, even when these characters go behind this light pole base, and the footsteps don't change their sound at all, it's going to be one of those situations where you're going to kind of be thrown out of the scene, You're not going to feel unconsciously as engaged with the scene because the sound isn't right. So what Sandy does when he's recreating footsteps is he has to actually change the sound as this footsteps are shown going behind some sort of object. And so what he'll do is he'll actually bring in baffles. And the baffles need to be about the same size and about the same shape as the objects that have been filmed. Okay? So if in fact, it is a scene where two characters are walking down the street, the sidewalk here, and at one point they're shown going behind this light post base right here. When they are recreating the footsteps also have to sound like they are being heard from behind the light post, especially if the camera's from showing them from the side like that over here. And so what he'll do is he'll bring in a baffle that's about the size and the shape of that light post base. And he says that shape matters, right? And I'm just putting this picture of the door here just to make sure we have our intuitions. That if you're listening to a dialogue and all of a sudden the door shuts, so the camera is positioned between, or the other characters are positioned on the other side of the door, that the voices are muffled. We are aware at when sounds are obstructed by objects. Okay, that sound has to change. That sound has to change too. And what Sandy's saying is, yes, the sound has to change, but it has to change in such a way that the way it changes is sensible based on the objects that's doing the sound obstruction. Okay, which is really amazing. He's saying, yeah, believe it or not, the human auditory system is sensitive enough to know how footsteps should sound when they go behind a small object or a large object. They should sound different. And if they don't, okay, again, people are kind of thrown out of the scene, even if it's not a conscious realization of why they're thrown out of the scene, the same thing happens. And I think we've done some research to suggest that Sandy's right. And so just lots of people have done this sort of research. I like to talk about the research in my lab just because I make it intuitive, but don't worry, we're not going to be talking about only research in my lab through the course. But we've done research to show that people are in fact sensitive to when sounds are occluded by objects. Okay, so this is kind of, I guess you could say, the perception of sound occluding surfaces. And basically, we've done a bunch of experiments to show that if you cover up a loudspeaker by some object, that people are sensitive to where that object is. And so what we do is we show people how the experiment's going to work. We bring them into the room at first, and we show them what we're going to do. This is actually two experiments that's being depicted here. Let's talk about the one with the side panels first. And ignore this kind of gray panel here. But what we do is we show them there's loudspeakers here, and there's a noise that's coming from, actually in this case it's recorded crowd sound. We just used a recording that we made in the kind of commons cafeteria on campus, because it's just a nice kind of rich, familiar sound. And we had the sound being produced through a set of loudspeakers that were affixed to a wall of the laboratory room. But most important, we had these panels here that were kind of panels that are used for soundproofing behind the walls of a room that could roll either closer to each other or further apart, okay? And we showed subjects that this is what they're going to do, that they were going to blindfold them and bring them up to this wall, and their job is to listen to the sounds that will be sometimes obstructed by these side panels here, these as they're shown here in black. And their job is kind of weird. It's not to tell us whether the sounds have been obstructed, but to tell us more than that. Are the sounds being obstructed by the panels enough so that the space between the panels is big enough for you to fit through? I know, it sounds like a kind of a weird thing, but we had a sense that they'd have no problem telling us when the sounds were being covered up by the panels. We wanted to know how precise they could be about the location of those panels. And so sometimes the panels were here, and subjects would walk up to the panels blindfolded at this point, and they'd be able to hear the sounds coming through the panels, but they'd have to try to determine the location of those panels enough to just say whether or not they could walk through them. In this case, they couldn't. They say, nope, I couldn't walk through that space that's created by the sound obstructing panels by walking straight through. I might be able to do it by turning, but we asked them to judge it by walking straight through. In another trial, we'd put on headphones of the subject so they couldn't hear what we were doing. We'd roll the panels back and ask, and then bring the subjects up again and take off their headphones and say, okay, listen to those sounds again and listen to where the panels are obstructing the sound. Is that a big enough space for you to walk through? And in this case, the correct answer would be yes. And what we found was when we asked subjects to do this, despite how weird they thought the task was, so they sounded, we asked them, can they fit through? Can they fit between? And we had another experiment. We asked them if they could fit under another board that was going up and down. In both cases, they were terrific at this. They could judge the space between the edges of two boards or under the board almost as accurately as if they were able to see the boards, which really, really, really surprised us. I mean, that's just amazing. So again, subjects come in here, they think there's just no way they're going to be able to perform this task. This is the strangest task in the world. I'm not really listening to the locations of sounds. I'm listening to the locations of things that are blocking sounds. And my job is to determine whether or not the space that's between these boards that are blocking the sound is large enough for me to be able to walk through. People think, I have no idea that I'd be able to do this. And after a while, they say, I think I'm doing okay here. After, say, 10, 15 trials, as we move the boards back and forth, they say, yeah, I'm doing okay. And as it turns out, their accuracy is almost as good as if they were seeing. The blindfold was off, there was no sound. They were just seeing the boards like this and judging whether they could fit through the boards by looking. That's how sensitive your brain is to these things. Typically you're not asked to do this, but in an experiment like this, you can do it. People were good. Based on how good people were with this, we decided to try something even stranger, kind of a little bit motivated by our discussion with Sandy Berman about how not only the size and the position of these sound obstructing objects is important, but also the shape is important as well. We decided to see if people could judge the shape of sound obstructing objects based on how they cover sound. And so we just created this big triangle, a big disc, big round disc, and a big square, about an inch deep, inch thick, but you can get a sense for how, maybe 2.5, 3 feet tall, that sort of thing. And positioned these different objects in front of a set of loudspeakers that, again, these loudspeakers were emanating the sound of a crowd recorded in the Commons cafeteria, right? And so what we would do, we told people what was going to happen. We told people you're going to try to judge, is it a circle? The disc, is it a triangle? Is it a square? And we'll do this one at a time. And in between the trials, we put headphones on them so they couldn't hear things like us changing the shape in between. So they would move back they had the blindfold on their entire time. We have them move back, put on headphones, we change the shape, we then bring them forward, we turn on the sound behind the shapes, we take off their headphones, and they say, okay, we say, can you tell us whether this is the triangle, the square, or the disc? And they move around a little bit, and they say, I think that's the triangle. Okay, and then we put the headphones on, move them back, the same thing again and again. And everybody could do this at better than chance levels. Okay? They're not great, they're not as, certainly they weren't as good with this. They're not, chance would be 30%, and a lot of people are getting like 60% correct, that sort of thing. That's better than chance. They're not as good as them. This was just floored us how good people were at this test. But people can do this. Everybody recognized the 3 shapes of better than chance levels, which is impressive on its own. But we had 3 or 4 subjects that were astonishingly good at this. 80 to 90% correct. Okay? We had no idea people were going to be this good. And so after we found out how good they were at this, we contacted them again and told them that they really had a skill at this. And we then asked them, what they might have had in their background that allowed them to do this task. And they all had something in common. They had all done some type of sound mixing or balancing for theater or their church, or they were DJs or something like that, right? I think two out of the four of these amazing subjects were DJs. So that's really interesting. And they say, yeah, I guess when I think about it, I have to walk around the room when I position the loudspeakers at a party. So these are the DJs that, kind of bring, their computer and their loudspeakers, and they play at parties and weddings and that sort of stuff. And what they do is they're the ones that often select where this loudspeakers are going to go at the party. They say, I listen very carefully before the party starts to make sure that those loudspeakers are in the right place. And if I don't think that it sounds great, I'll move around the loudspeakers. Same, one guy did sound balancing, sound mixing for his church. And he said, yeah, I kind of have to determine where, that I'm sitting in the middle of the church and I'm listening to the band, and I got to make sure things sound good at different locations of the church. And from that experience, they had this ability to absolutely be able to recognize these shapes at amazingly accurate levels, which is just tremendous. It's really, really impressive. Oh boy. Here comes the gardener again. I apologize if you can hear this. Hopefully it won't be too distracting. Okay. One more thing I wanted to chat a little bit about with regard to the lessons Hollywood can teach us, and I think this is so interesting. But as I said, I'm easily amused. Everything I've talked about, being able to recognize rooms by sound, being able to recognize the location you're in a room by sound, being able to recognize when a sound is being obstructed. These are things that people are actually getting better at, over the last, say, 20 years. Really, really interesting. So it's not as if, this is something that, we're just born with this skill and this is the best skill, the best we're going to get at it. Because of the nature of sound recordings and sound reproduction, it seems to be that we're more picky with these things than we used to be. In other words, our brains are getting trained to be more sensitive to these things because sound reproduction has gotten so much better. Sound fidelity has gotten so much better. And I've got a couple of anecdotes to kind of tell you a little bit about this. One was an interview I did with a sound mixer. Actually, this was a soap opera. I don't know if you folks know if Days of Our Lives is still on. When I interviewed this gentleman, Zolia Sase, this Days of Our Lives was the longest running soap opera on. It was 50-something years at that point when I interviewed him. And, as I mentioned before, soap operas don't have the sort of budgets to do sound engineering that big time movies do and that sort of thing. So he's responsible for all the sound except for the music, everything to do with it. And he told me this really terrific anecdote about how experience can play a role in being sensitive to kind of these sorts of reflective sounds, this kind of sound structure, sound signatures of rooms. What he told me was this. I guess at one point, the characters on the show, many of them, the actors, the characters, have been around for 25, 30 years or something like this. So the people that watch these shows have often watched it for that long, and they're used to the characters, they're used to the characters' apartments or houses and all that sort of thing. And he told me at one point they were bringing in these new camera systems, and these new camera systems basically were cameras that were on tracks that allowed the camera workers, the camera controllers, to actually do all the control remotely, you know, using levers and stuff like that. So in other words, they didn't have to go out there onto the set and actually move the cameras around by hand. They could do it, you know, using these little remote control handles. In doing so, when they installed these into the various sets for the show, what they had to do was change baffles. Okay. So what they did is, you know, they had sound baffles put into each of these sets that they had to move around a little bit in order to make room for these new camera systems. So he talked about one that was in, I guess, you know, one of these, you know, long-standing characters, Bo. I don't know if it's on anymore, or I don't know anything about the characters, but I guess there was this one character, Bo, and they really had to move around the baffles that are used for sound. You know, the things that Jay Patterson had someone like him had installed. Okay, so what happens here is they start, you know, filming scenes and broadcasting scenes in Bo's apartment after the baffles have changed. And he said all of a sudden he started getting letters, and they were like letters, like in paper letters and envelopes from these people, these fans who had been watching forever, or probably, you know, in their 70s and 80s and watched it forever, who said, there's something wrong with Bo's apartment. Did you change something? Did you change the color a little bit? Did you change the lighting a little bit? And, you know, he said, no, the only thing that changed, you know, was the sound. And he said that people were so used to, you know, experiencing Bo's apartment through the TV with the same sound, that even these small changes just to the sound were enough to throw people off. Okay, so what he did ended up having to do is come back and try to replace the baffles close to where they were before. So for the people watching it, they wouldn't be kind of made, you know, uneasy by their experience of scenes that were in Bo's apartment. It's really interesting. So that's how kind of, you know, one's experience can play a role in this sort of thing too. But with regard to you, you know, if you're not a soap opera watcher, this plays a role, because this experience thing plays a role because of what I was alluding to before. That the improvements in sound recording for movies and TV shows, as well as sound reproduction in theaters and home theaters, has actually proven to be a new challenge for the folks that do this. Everyone I talked to said that, oh yes, you know, let me step back and say, you know, we're all often told about how we have to be careful of our hearing, and maybe, you know, your generation's hearing is not going to be as good because you're listening to so many things through headphones, and I'm sure you're wise, and by now you know you shouldn't be listening to things loud through your headphones and all that stuff, you know, this sort of thing. And so, you know, maybe your intuition is that you don't hear subtleties the way, you know, the previous generations do, because you might be damaging your hearing a little bit. And even if you are damaging your hearing a tiny bit, don't listen loud, so don't damage your hearing. But even if you have a little bit, your attention to detail, because of how good the reproduction is better than my generation's. I promise you. You folks are hearing things that I don't. And not just because I'm older. It's because I was raised on crappy headphones and speakers that were in TV sets that were this big and sounded terrible. You folks are, you know, using sound, are listening to sound that is so much better quality. And that has proven to be a challenge. It's proven to be a challenge for people that work in movies, people that work in video, people that work in concert halls even. So this I thought was fascinating. I was really interested in how this is occurring. And I was struck by this new type of theater design, concert design method that is being used now across the world. So, you know, you folks have probably gone to some concerts, maybe you used to, you know, like the, you know, just a big open room, like at a club or something like that, and listen to, you know, music, and, you know, the sound isn't great in that situation. Maybe you've seen shows in theaters that are older. You know, a lot of modern theaters in Southern California, but if you've been in New York City, you might know that, you know, some theaters are are better than others with regard to how the sound seems, you know, how easy it is to make out, you know, different instruments or, you know, lines of dialogue, that sort of thing. If you've been to Hollywood Bowl, you might notice that, you know, they have to do a lot of correction for sound because it's in big open space with you know, kind of acoustics that are to some degree kind of dependent on the actual, you know, canyon that the theater is in and everything. So you have some sense of that. But so a lot of energy is put into new theater design to make sure the audience is able to hear, you know, the nuances of the music as best as possible. So I was able to interview this acoustic engineer, architectural acoustician, named Yasuhisa Toyota. And what he has done is come up with a really kind of cool way of designing the inside of theaters so the sound is very, very clear. Okay. Now, you can see him there. He's on the left. And he is standing in front of Disney Hall, which he designed the inside of. Okay? He's designed many, many theaters since then. I don't know if any of you have been to Disney Hall, but please do go at some point before you leave Southern California, if you're going on to grad school or something, or you're moving away from the area. It is a great place. It's very cool. You've probably seen pictures of it from the outside. It's also very cool on the inside. And now you'll know a little bit about how it was designed so you get the very best sound possible. Okay. And I talked to him about this. I said, so you're very concerned with people being able to hear individual instruments? He said, absolutely. And he said, I think that is the challenge of modern and future architectural acoustics. I said, why? He said, because people are listening to music now in such a way that they can clearly hear individual instruments, okay? Much more clearly than the old days. And there's reasons for that. First of all, back when I was interviewing him, he was talking about CD quality, and now we're talking about MP3 or better quality. I think you know, the quality is much better than it was on old vinyl, at least. I guess people for newer vinyl and newer vinyl systems will vouch for them. Those formats kind of rivaling, you know, competing against MP3 or streaming quality, but. You know, he said things are much clearer than they were when he and I are the same age when we were younger. And I said, yeah, that makes sense. He said, the other thing is, it is now the case that orchestras and jazz bands, rock bands, any type of music, the instruments, or even, you know, doing stuff from, you know, samples that are, you know, like on GarageBand or whatever system that's being used, instruments are being recorded from very close microphones. Okay, let's talk about you know, classical music for now. You know, given that is what's mostly being performed in this theater. In the old days, what they would do to record a orchestra playing a classical piece is the orchestra would go on a stage or in a studio. Didn't really make too much of a difference. If it's a big enough studio, they'll do that. And the microphones would be hung down from the ceiling somewhere, say, in the middle of the theater, if they're recording in a theater. Right? If they're recording in a big studio, the orchestra would be over here. Okay? There'd be 3, maybe 4 microphones hanging down from the ceiling or somehow suspended about, say, 20 to 30 feet away. And these microphones would be capturing what the entire orchestra sounded like. That's how recordings used to be done until about, I think, the late 80s, early 90s. And then what they decided to do was do some of the microphones were placed back there, but they also gave each instrument a microphone. Each instrument has a microphone either right in front of it or often connected to the instrument itself, depending on the type of instrument it is. So they're capturing the sound as it is experienced from, say, the audience position, as well as how it's experienced from the musician's position, the individual musician's position. And they'll kind of mix all that together into the final sound of the recording that is then, sold to the listener. So what that does is it kind of allows the listener to hear the instruments much more clearly than they used to. And they expect that when they go to a concert. Now that's tricky, right? That, you can imagine, is a very tricky thing to do, because at a concert, what you're doing is you're listening from, somewhere back here. This is the interior of the Disney home, by the way. You're listening to somewhere over here, or I think this is taken, the picture is taken from the seating that's here. We'll talk about this specific design in just a second. But that's where you're hearing the orchestra. The orchestra is down here at these little these little risers here, these shallow risers. The orchestra is down there. This is where the conductor is positioned, right there. Okay. You're sitting in a position. So you are probably in the best position to hear the entire mix of the orchestra. But what Mr. Toyota says is that, in fact, you're actually used to hearing not only the sound from that position, but also the sound from the position of the instruments themselves. So what he has to do is design his halls to the best degree possible in order to capture the individual instrument sounds, as if in some ways, despite the fact that you're seated, I don't know, 100 feet away, 200 feet away, as if you are seated right next to the instrument. And so what he has done, he's come up with this design of the interior of the system. It's just kind of the way that the space is constructed, okay? So that people get the very clearest possible sound. And this is called a vineyard design. And you can understand why it's called a vineyard design. It's almost as if there's like tiers of seating, as if this was built, you know how on a vineyard, if it's built on a hill, you'll have kind of like, tiers of where the grape vines are, like that on a slope. It's kind of like that. Oops. Sorry, hold on just a second. Yeah, this is working right. You guys can all see. I just lost my screen, but I'm okay, at least as far as I can see. Okay. So there are tiers of seats, and in addition to that, there are actual sound reflecting walls that are put on the sides of, say, every set of, say, 30 seats as they go across here. So, you're seeing, you're from sitting way back in the back, you're seeing the orchestra. And if you look to the side, there are big wooden walls on the side. And what that does, that design, the fact that it's kind of coming up like this, allows you to have kind of a more, maybe you're a little bit closer to where the orchestra is because of its steepness. The fact that it's tiered like that. Also, the fact that there are many sound reflecting walls on the side of you allows you to get a kind of clarity of the instruments, as well as an intimacy. Okay? There's lots of different dimensions that you can try to kind of highlight in designing the interior of a concert hall like this. You want to have a good mix of the instruments. You want to have a kind of a good loudness. You want to have, well, I don't know, there's lots of other things too. But what he is after with this design, his design has become remarkably popular, okay, is clarity and intimacy. He wants the listener, regardless of where they're sitting, to be able to hear each instrument clearly, and to sound, that he wants the sound to seem as if it's coming from very close to people. And that's one of the things those walls do, those sound reflecting walls on the side, okay? I mean, I've been there a number of times, and it's interesting, you're looking at the orchestra down there, but like during a solo, say an oboe solo, you're not quite sure where the sound's coming from. And it's not like it's not amplified really or anything like that. In most cases, there's no sound, there's no loudspeakers or sound systems. It's all natural sound coming right from the orchestra up through the theater, right? But you're not quite sure where the sound comes from, because it's kind of made more clear by the fact that it's kind of bouncing off these kind of sidewalls that are close to you. It is very impressive of how clear the orchestra seems and how close you feel to the orchestra. It is really something. And I think if you'd really be impressed if you have a chance to go down and listen to some of you have gone. Great, it works really well. Maybe too well in this sense. When they opened it up, people were very impressed of how clear the orchestra sounded. However, not only does the orchestra sound clear, but other audience members can be heard very clearly by the entire audience. Now, that's hopefully not a problem. The audience is trying to be quiet and listen to the orchestra. However, if somebody has a cough, cold and flu season, normal cold and flu season, and they have a little bit of a cough or something like that, it is heard, it is by the entire theater very clearly, and as if that person coughing is right by you. So within the first few months of opening up the theater, I think they did open up during the winter months when people are more likely to have a little cough. What they did is they installed big bins of cough drops at all the entrances and said, please, if you feel yourself having a little cough, please take a cough drop so the rest of the theater doesn't have to listen to the clarity of your cough because of the design. And that works, except I've been there when this has happened. People are very respectful and they will take their cough drops when they feel cough coming on. But what you end up hearing is them unwrapping their cough drops. It's not as bad because it only lasts a second, but during a quiet passage of the orchestra, you might hear, and it's somebody completely on the other side of the theater unwrapping their cough drop, which, it's a little distracting for a second, but it really kind of shows how amazing the design is, that the clarity of sounds and the intimacy of sounds in that theater can really be brought out by this type of design. And the whole motivation, according to Mr. Toyota, is that people are so used to hearing sounds close to them and clear in the recordings they listen to at home, whether it is music or movies or TV shows or whatever. We're now expecting an intimacy and clarity that no one ever has before because of these recording techniques. And that's why he designs these theaters the way he does. And it's amazing. It really is amazing what he's able to capture here in this. And it is one of the most, he's gotten tremendously successful. When I met with him, they had just opened up the Disney Hall, but he was working on redesigning the inside of the Sydney Opera House. The Sydney, that's kind of like that iconic building. When you see postcards of Australia, you kind of see those kind of the wave-like building. That's the Sydney Opera House, which is a really cool building from the outside. It's an iconic structure. But from the inside, it's not great acoustically. So he was hired to redesign it, and he redesigned it using this sort of technique, which I think is very, very cool. Okay, so let's just do a quick summary here of this lecture of reflected sound. Our lessons from Hollywood and research, and you've already seen all these things, is that we are exquisitely sensitive to how room structure sound. Okay, so the idea that, yeah, it's kind of cool that we can use reflected sound for this purpose. It's more than cool. We are really, really good at this, and it makes the job more challenging. And probably more fun, but challenging for sound engineers and sound mixers and sound designers and architectural acousticians. We are not only sensitive to how room structure sound, we're sensitive to how different positions in rooms structure sound differently. And that's the kind of the mic thing that you just saw, the shotgun mic thing. 3, we are sensitive to when sounds are obstructed, as well as the specifics, the details of the object that is doing the obstruction. All these are examples of how we hear things in the world that are not just making sound, but things that are reflecting sound. These are all details. And then finally, as you just saw, we are getting more sensitive to these dimensions as time goes on because of the way recordings are done and the way recordings are reproduced. Okay, cool. All right, let's take a tiny break and do another quiz question. There we go. And this one is something that you just saw. Oh, let me say the chat. Oh my gosh. Okay, good questions here. Ivy asks, for experimental purpose, what's the distance for testing sound in different parts of the room? Is there a significant sound difference every inch, every foot? Okay. Yes, well, okay. So the fact that different parts of the room sound different, it really depends on the type of room, the type of listener, and I guess the way the recordings are done. So yes, I would say it doesn't make a difference whether you're say an inch away from a position. That's not going to make too much of a difference. But maybe on the scale of feet, depending on the room, you might be able to detect when, say, a microphone in a room has been recording in different positions. You might be able to detect that thing. It's actually a great question. That has not been ever tested experimentally. It is the sort of thing that might have been tested in the architectural acoustics literature. They probably, when they're evaluating theaters and that sort of thing, do measurements from very, very different positions, and they probably have a way that they establish how much they need to move the microphone every time. But I don't think it's ever been done with human subjects actually listening to see if they could tell the difference. It's a great question. Oh, Ivy, you've also performed at Disney Hall with your choir. This sounds amazing. It's super true to pitch. That's really, really interesting. That's really, really interesting. That's great. Yeah, I would imagine being down on the stage and hearing all the, what it sounds like from the stage is just amazing. That's great. Thanks for sharing that. Very cool. Okay, let's go to our poll question, our last one for today. This is something we just discussed too. It should be an easy one. It's about ambient sound shift. Okay, remember ambient sound shift. We talked about how this is relevant to how, different parts of rooms sound different. So the question is, ambient sound shift, A, is a byproduct of recording actors with a shotgun microphone. B, can make two characters in a scene sound like they're in separate rooms. Okay. C, shows that the brain is sensitive to the position in a room from which one is listening. Or D, all of the above. And I see there's a little glitch in the way this is laid out here. C, the answer should read, shows that the brain is sensitive to the position in a room from which one is listening. That's all it should say there. And D is all the above. And so let's go ahead and launch it. You'll see there's a little glitch in answer C, but don't worry about it. Just ignore that part D. You guys see this okay? Just want to make sure. Yeah. Uh-oh. Good. All right, another 20 seconds or so. All right, that should do it. The correct answer is again D, all of the above. Ambient sound shift is a byproduct of recording actors with a shotgun microphone. That's supposed to say shotgun microphone. It doesn't. I apologize. It did it before? Oh, I'll fix these next time. Sorry about that. It can make, potentially, because of the way the shotgun microphone goes back and forth between the characters, it can make the characters in a scene sound like they're from two separate rooms. So both of those are true. And C is also true. It shows that the brain is sensitive to the position in a room from which one is listening. So where you are when you're listening to the room. So this one is, most of you got this. This one is also all of the above. That is the correct one. Go ahead and take a picture. And I apologize. This is supposed to say is a byproduct of recording actors with a shotgun microphone. I don't know why that's not listed there. I apologize. Okay. But you know, you got this. And you can ignore this little stuff here too. Not sure why it formats like this. I will look into that and we'll get it next time. Okay, any questions on this? Terrific. We will start on Tuesday talking about perceiving sound sources, and that will start with a discussion on how blind athletes play softball. Okay, have a nice weekend, everybody, and we'll see you on Tuesday.